present, for you to meet really and get the answers straight from the horse's mouth on questions that you might have, perspectives that you might want to pass along, so that you can take that away and move forward. Because again, really, this is going to pass to you someday, and the fact that you have this opportunity to talk to the current generation about these issues, the chief prosecutors, I think is a tremendous opportunity for us. So we didn't want you to walk away from the dialogues never having had an opportunity to ask whatever question you want, and on any subject, but hopefully you'll keep it focused towards human rights, international humanitarian law, what have you. But also you can ask the personal questions too, like what was it like, or what have you. So don't hold back on a question, please. There's no stupid question, there's no dumb question. But we wanted to set this up so that you as students would have the opportunity to meet the chief prosecutors in the world about whatever subject you want to talk about. So that was the genesis. Clayton Sweeney, God bless him, stepped forward and provided some very important fiscal support. And then the International Bar Association took that spirit this year and will allow us to continue forward. And this is being broadcast kind of around the world now.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do format-wise, we'll take one question from the high school students and then go one question to the law students, okay? And Allie, you had one prepared that you said, and please identify yourself. Just my first name would be great. Tell them what year you are in high school or law school, and give a little identifying bio there. So Allie, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Allie. I'm from Orchard Park, New York. I'm going to be a senior this fall at Orchard Park High School. And my question is for a prosecutor from Gian. And I want to know, how is the United Nations supporting the Cambodia Tribunal, and how long do you believe it'll take until the court can come to a conclusion?
Well, the United Nations negotiated a treaty with the government of Cambodia in order to establish the court. But the court itself is funded by voluntary contributions by various other states. But the international side of the court are United Nations employees. I have a contract with the United Nations in the case of Cambodia. And David Shecker, who was just on the last panel, is the special representative of the Secretary General for the court. His main responsibility is to raise money for us, but asking individual states to contribute. It's not part of the UN budget.
That was a very succinct answer. Very impressive. How about a question from our friends at Case?
Hi, I'm Richard Wongman, third year at Case Western Reserve. This is more open-ended, slightly existential question, but I know for many of the law students this is very pertinent. Within 5 years, there will probably only be one of the tribunals left, ICC, but for many of us who want to maintain this work, how do you see perhaps enhancing and developing the technical capability of these kinds of prosecutions, whether at a national level or international level, and how do you see the new generation of prosecutors or defendants or defense counsel working in this field, even though it would be limited functionally 1, maybe 2 courts at most by the time that we get to that point in our careers?
If that would be great if you would like to go forward, or
Sure.
was it directed to anyone in particular?
No, this is broad. I would say perhaps David Cranberg also did in this quite a while, as well as Hassan Bell. So, but really anyone involved.
That research.
Okay. No, this is a question we're having from our interns all the time. We have at our tribunal from Yugoslavia 80 interns a year. They're all law students, and they all want to become international lawyers. And fact is that it will be much more difficult for you to be successful on the market of international justice than it was for us, because the competition was not as difficult as it is today, and there were more international tribunals being set up. I don't think personally that it will be only the ICC, because the ICC will never ever be able to cope with all the problems which are there. So I think there will be other ad hoc, not probably ad hoc, but hybrid tribunals. I think if a solution for Syria is found one day politically, and I hope it's as soon as possible, the ICC alone will never ever be able to deal with the situation. You have more victims than in the 3 years war in the former Yugoslavia, where an ad hoc tribunal was set up with 161 people indicted. So I think there will be jobs, and I think that the UN is investing much more in human rights areas, in the peacekeeping missions. You have also more and more NGOs dealing in this area. So I think there will be job opportunities. But as I said last year, what I'm always saying, especially to my American students, is look, of course, English is the number one language. It's the most important one, and the main working language for international organizations. But if you look at the situations where the UN is very active in African countries, French is very important. If it's in Latin America, it's Spanish. So in addition to focusing on your studies and international humanitarian, international criminal law, focus on languages and language skills if you want to increase your chances of being successful on the international market.
I really want to underscore, I tell my students at Syracuse, learn another language. Take the time. You all go out and run for a half hour. Once you go out and just get Rosetta Stone or whatever and work on a language for a half hour. In other words, it's really, really important if you want to be in this business to have a familiarity with another language. But I'm excited for you because there may be less courts, but the future of modern international criminal law is with the domestic systems. So there's plenty of room for you to be involved in domestic systems, but also someone is still going to have to be out in the world in a human rights capacity, and that's NGOs. And I see a much bigger role for non-governmental organizations out there to fill the gap somewhat as the world begins to shape and mold, as the tribunals begin to contract, it'll expand a bit. But I don't think this is a dead end. I think this is just the beginning of the beginning. I don't know where it's going, but that shouldn't dissuade you. And for law students, take the bar, pass the bar, but then think about non-law jobs to get your foot in the door, and then other things happen for you.
I also think that it's important to, if you're going to practice in the United States, to be aware of what U.S. laws you could interpret in a way that would cover these kinds of crimes. And if you want to be an international criminal law litigator, get a job where you get litigation experience. Because you always pick up what the law is. But your skills in the courtroom, your skills with organizing a case, with presenting a case, arguing, those are the fundamental skills that you need to master. And I would suggest you do that in a national setting. Doesn't have to be related to international crimes. Just become a good litigator, and then you can move into these international crimes as well. And there are also NGOs out there that are legally oriented NGOs that are doing a lot of important work with national prosecuting authorities and investigators. The Open Society Justice Initiative, for example, has lawyers on its staff, and they work in DRC with mobile courts that go around and prosecute sexual violence cases. So there are opportunities, and it's simply a matter of being very open about what's possibly you'd be interested in and researching that.
I think ideally we should be moving towards making the International Criminal Court universal in its membership, particularly at a time when these ad hoc tribunals are fading out. It's important, therefore, that all of us try to encourage our respective governments and other governments to try and become party to the Rome Statute. That will not be enough, however. Even if the ICC were to become universal, it will be able to deal with the main cases worldwide. The primary responsibility for dealing with these cases will continue to rest with the national courts and maybe with regional courts as well. So there is a lot of room for practice, even at the national level, in the area of international criminal justice. So you should train yourselves with that, learn international criminal law, be good litigators, good prosecutors, and there will be work at the national level, at the sub-regional level, and at the international level.
Mr. Stewart, would you agree with things with that prognosis, that there will be jobs available, but they'll just perhaps be in different forms that perhaps we haven't seen yet?
Well, I think the International Criminal Court, where I'm deputy prosecutor, will always be looking for talent. And American talent is as welcome as talent from any other part of the world, even though the United States is not a state party to the Rome Statute. We have very fine American lawyers working in the Office of the Prosecutor, I could say that. I think, too, looking at the domestic scene, I don't know what the situation is in the United States, but certainly in Canada, the Department of Justice, my country of origin, Canada, the Department of Justice has a war crimes and crimes against humanity section. So with the movement of population and individuals around the world today, countries are becoming very sensitive to the possibility that amongst those coming in are people who've been involved with dreadful crimes and atrocities overseas, and are accepting responsibility for conducting prosecutions. I know in Canada recently there have been a couple of prosecutions of Rwandans involved in the genocide in 1994. And the other thing is, of course, the military. Military organizations, the armed forces of countries like the United States, I think the United States Treaty was at the origin of it, teach the law of armed conflict. It's a part of officer training. There are careers, as far as I understand it, in armed forces in many different countries involving JAG and enforcement of the law of armed conflict. So there's another area to think about. And I think what Brenda said is important. And if you don't mind, I'll use myself as an example. She briefed me on the first case I ever did in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And when I arrived from Toronto in Kigali, I had never studied international criminal law. I had never prosecuted in that sort of environment. But I had many years of experience as a trial and appellate lawyer in a criminal system. So I had developed skills. I also happened to speak French, which was useful. So that that advice about getting a really good, solid experience in your own jurisdiction so that you have a set of skills to offer to an international organization is very wise advice. And it's the sort of advice I used to give to interns back in the day when I was at ICTY and even today.
Fantastic. That was a great question, because I think everybody in the room has some aspiration in some of that, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a $25 question.
Yeah, that was.
How do I get to be what you are?
Yeah.
I get it.
So, Hala, our Impunity Watch Award winner, congratulations again.
Yes.
And
Congratulations.
Share your question with us, Hala.
My question is for Dr. David Crane, and what are your goals for the I Am Syria campaign in the next few years?
Well, the I Am Syria campaign was founded for two reasons. One is to let the people of Syria know that they're not alone. Of course, this was started 2 years ago when it was very bleak. It's still bleak. In fact, actually, it's bleaker, frankly. But it seemed like the whole world was just sitting watching, and really nothing was less was being done than less is now. I mean, so we started the Green Hand campaign where we'd have everybody show their green hand, and actually that was fairly successful. But part two was to also teach about Syria, set up a program where we wanted to do a test bed of whether we could get world's teachers to take a lesson plan, which was largely drafted by Drew and his team, and put it out there so that teachers from around the world could take these lesson plans and teach about what's going on concurrently in Syria. And as he had mentioned this morning, we've had over 10,000 teachers do that, and we're very pleased about that. So I continue to see the future of I Am Syria is to continue to maintain awareness about Syria itself, but also then provide modalities by which the tragedy in Syria can be taught to students such as yourself and others so that they could understand and be able to dialogue and talk to their families and friends about what's happening. The biggest challenge we have in the business that we're in sometimes is people just don't understand what we're doing. In some ways it's almost indifference, not because they don't care, they just don't know. And so awareness is just as important in facing down the beast of impunity as what we do or what we have done at the international level. If people understood, were aware, perhaps their voices could be heard and maybe stop some of these tragedies. So that's how I envision I Am Syria.
Excellent. Thank you, Hal. Back to our law students. Yes. Go ahead, sure. What's your name? I'm sorry. Abby, and you're, oh yeah, we're excited to see where you're, okay. All right. Yeah.
So to keep on the subject of Syria, so there's a big issue now with foreign fighters going over to Syria, including
Continue.
what do you think the biggest issue will be prosecution? Prosecuting foreign fighters, especially, I think someone had it, someone are so confused as to if you could prosecute for the crime that been completed in Syria, or they want to do a prosecution based on their what they did the Syria or they left.
Wow, that's a certain. Please go ahead.
I mean, it is a big security concern in Europe in general. I am from Belgium. Allegedly, there are more than 200 people, young people between 16 and 22 from Belgium who went to fight for ISIS and other Islamic fundamentalist group fighting there. There are more than 2,000 out of the European Union, and there's first of all a lot of questions the European security forces are asking themselves: what will happen if those young people are coming back into the national European territories because they have European citizenship, and will this have an increase in terrorist threat as a result for European security? So you have already all this more general security dimension which is debated. Then in relation to prosecution, it depends very much on your national legislation. In Belgium, for example, we have the extraterritorial jurisdiction, where in Belgium we can prosecute Belgian citizens for crime committed abroad. This is as such not a problem. The problem is collecting evidence and getting enough evidence to convince a judge in court. And if international tribunals have no access to those scenes, of course national have even less. And I would say in relation to Syria, this will be one of the big challenges when we speak about more than 200,000 victims. As I said, it's already in terms of numbers of victims more than the years of war in the former Yugoslavia. So I don't know who will be one day the ICC prosecutor and or a hybrid prosecutor or a national prosecutor who will have to deal with those cases. But it will be a nightmare to collect evidence from where the evidence is today, to find witnesses willing to testify, to have insider witnesses. So I think the biggest challenge will not be to find a forum for prosecution. The big challenge will be to collect sufficient evidence to convince national, international judges.
I think another equally daunting challenge will be to get the people handed over to you once they're indicted. Because if they're not within an area where you have forces that will arrest them and detain them and hand them over, you may have indictments that you never prosecute, assuming you don't have trials in absentia, that you never prosecute because you can never get the people.
Another issue that's interesting from the point of view of the International Criminal Court is the question of jurisdiction, but I think it's absolutely right to consider that that's simply the threshold question. That's just the beginning of your problems, as has been pointed out. But the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction where crimes are allegedly committed on the territory of a state party or by nationals of a state party. And this is an interesting hook, which I don't know how it should be interpreted or what the result should be, but theoretically, if you had, I suppose I could put it this way, a national of a state party in a very senior position in one of these extremist organizations directing the commission of atrocious crimes, then there'd be an argument for jurisdiction over those crimes as a result of that person's nationality. But it's a complex issue, and many of these young people we're talking about are not in positions of command or control, as far as I know. They're essentially the foot soldiers, the jihadi foot soldiers, and I don't know that would, given the approach that we take to the most responsible for atrocities, that would open the way for the ICC to have jurisdiction. But I think, with respect to the comments that Serge and Brenda have made, you would have to embark upon a very sophisticated method of collecting evidence. There's a lot of cyber evidence, a tremendous amount of YouTube footage, but the problem with that is you have to authenticate it. You've got to be able to time it, and there are apparently sophisticated ways of doing it that are quite beyond my comprehension, but we do have people who we are developing those capacities. But that's really to get a big picture, perhaps to identify some of the worst atrocities, but you ultimately have to get right down to the ground. You have to prove what happened on the ground, but then you have to work back up as to who was responsible for that. And you may not be really aiming at prosecuting those people who directly perpetrated these events. You're looking for to go up the chain of command and to follow up into the higher echelons, the people who were really directing these things. And this is a difficult and sophisticated business, and a lot depends on the willingness of insiders and others to talk to you. They may have their own interests and concerns and worries, and obviously the security situation on the ground is vital for you to collect evidence. So it would be a daunting task, not necessarily one that would be unworthy. It would be a worthwhile undertaking, but one that would be extremely difficult.
Excellent. Lene, you had your hand up first, and then I'll let you know you two are interested, so we'll get to you in a second. But Lene, you go to Williamsville High School, right outside of Buffalo here?
Yes.
Tell us more.
I'm a junior. My name is Lene Carlin. My question is more of a general type of question. I want to know, how do you prepare yourself to prosecute an international figure?
Personally, emotionally, or more professionally?
Both, actually. I just want to know, how are you emotionally affected, and also how do you get yourself to prepare for, prosecuting an international figure?
I'll start with a little vignette. I think my colleagues have heard me say this. I flew from Freetown, Sierra Leone, to give a speech at Case Western Reserve University many years ago, and the late Henry King was still living and a professor there, and they had arranged for a private dinner for us, and we were deep into it, and it was really a tough time, and I was still cleaning the blood off my arms, so to speak. It was really a really difficult time. We were getting ready to go to trial, and a lot of stress. And I just happened to ask Henry King, who was at Nuremberg, as you would know, and I said, Henry, I said, how did you cope doing this every day? And he looked at me and he kind of smiled with a glint in his eye, and he said, about 2 scotches. I'm not advocating, but
you are on YouTube. That's really not the kind of advice you should give.
all the high school teachers are going, oh no. But the point is that actually what I'm saying is that, and I think that you have to maintain your sense of humanness. There's nothing wrong. I used to remember walking around the office with a smile. In other words, you can still be funny. You can still joke. You can still relax. You can still have a good time. You can, in other words, you don't take yourself so seriously. This business will melt you down to the point of you don't even realize it until you really have melted down. So that was my point, is you can still laugh. You can still enjoy life. But you have an honor and a privilege of representing a people's for justice. But there's nothing wrong with going out and having a pleasant evening where you have a beer and some pizza and what have you, and just be human beings. That was my real point. And I think that's what Henry's point was too.
In dealing with the cases from Rwanda, our court is located in Arusha. The tragedy occurred in Rwanda, that's another country. And one of the things I did, I never allowed anybody to get involved in prosecuting the cases until you visited Rwanda and you went to a massacre site. And the reason why I did it was I wanted you to go there and get angry, see what happened, get angry and come back. And you use your head and your heart. I want your heart in the job as well. But I want your head also, your professionalism. But I want a motivation from you also for going ahead. So I always send people to the massacre site. Go to Murambi, where 50,000 people are buried in one site. You look at it, you come back sufficiently motivated and angry enough to look at that case file and use your head then in order to prosecute it.
Well, you were wonderful, Hassan, in the support you gave us in appeals, because we used to, for every argument of an appeal, go to the sites. In an appeal, you're not dealing with the prosecution anymore. You don't have, theoretically, to have the same grasp of the terrain, if you will, that you would if you were going to do a trial, because you've got to be able to take witnesses through their experiences with a sense in your own mind of what the layout of the land, what the buildings and all that sort of thing looked like. But we used to do it on appeals with Hassan's support for that very reason. I remember one of my colleagues who had not been involved in the trials the way I had been, but who was getting ready to argue an appeal, going through Nyamurambe Church, Nyanabuye Church, with tears just pouring down her cheeks. So affected was she by the knowledge that in this sacred place people had been killed. You could still see the sort of blood, that sort of rusty brown coloring on the walls. So this is what really strikes you. Then you become very determined to prosecute your case. But I think everybody sitting here will tell you that as a lawyer, although you are affected as a human being, and you're dealing with witnesses particularly, and you're affected by the human story that they have to tell you, you have to maintain a professional detachment. It's their story. You have to facilitate that evidence being presented to the court, and you do have to steel yourself to be able to do that in a detached and professional way. And you must never lose sight of the respect you have to have for the rights of the accused, no matter how awful the crime is. Because for the process to have credibility, it has to be a fair process. And often it really depends on the prosecutors to share those values of fairness and propriety that's necessary in any prosecution. So it is a difficult task, isn't it?
That's why it's a combination of your heart and
determination, but also that detachment that's so important to justice.
Yeah, I think you almost have to be schizophrenic in your approach to things, because if you meet with witnesses, and I always went out with investigative teams, so I met with witnesses from the beginning and later, and when you hear their stories, your humanity reaches out to them. But at the same time, a part of you is evaluating what they're telling you. Because not only do you have to prepare to present, to be a conduit for them in court, you have to decide whether you believe they're credible or not. And people who you honestly believe have undergone absolutely horrible crimes against them, you may find are not credible for a variety of reasons. They may not be able to articulate what happened well enough for you to take them to court. They may, in their own mind, believe certain things happened that from the weight of the evidence, you just don't believe happened. So part of you has to be assessing their credibility at the same time that you are touched and at times absolutely appalled by what we do to each other and what has been done to these people. And in terms of prosecuting a high-level person, you do it the same way you prosecute a lower-level person. You just have more parts of the picture. And a higher-level complex case, you prosecute it the same way you eat the elephant, one bite at a time. And you have to be sure you're biting in the right order, and you still have the outline of the elephant when you're done, because you have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. But it is very difficult for people, and some people have to take a break from it. They become too traumatized by what they've seen.
David, I remember you sharing a wonderful story with our students a few years ago about chocolate and your staff.
Yeah, remember the chocolate Mondays.
Chocolate Mondays, was that it?
Well, again, when you're a chief prosecutor, you're not, you do a lot of things, but, your wonderful team is out there getting their fingernails dirty and actually seeing the real horror. And we had this UNPX, but you could buy these little mini chocolate bars. And so I would go on Saturday when we were doing my shopping for the week, and I'd buy a couple bags of these little chocolate candies, and on Monday I'd walk around and just give a chocolate bar to everybody in the office just to start the week off kind of with a smile or something positive. Because, again, there were moments, particularly the early days, the first 2 years, where it was just really a tough time on everybody. Not just from the facts and the horror of it all, but also just being sick all the time. I mean, cholera, typhoid fever, malaria, parasites, which we all hated. We'd all take malaria over parasites. But again, everybody was kind of sick. Everybody was kind of alone. We couldn't bring our families. There's no place for them to be, really. Some people brought families over and they left quickly because you couldn't go down to the shopping mall and relax or go to a movie. We watched movies in the strangest of places, but it wasn't in a movie theater. So little things in these areas, particularly the Special Court for Sierra Leone, we weren't in The Hague. We weren't in Arusha. We were literally at the crime scene. You have to do special things to make life worth getting up for every day so that you could do your job, your professional job. And most of our folks had a righteous fury about this. They were going to get these guys for what they have done. And people manifested that in certain ways. But chocolate candies was just another small way of bringing a little bit of normalcy into the office's lives. And, when you hand somebody a bar of chocolate, they'll smile. And smiling is important.
I think I'm the only one authorized to speak about chocolate because I'm from Belgium. But I never heard about your chocolate story, but I've also a chocolate story because I have read somewhere that eating dark chocolate makes people nicer. So I have also always a lot of dark chocolate in my office. And when we have a meeting and I see it's becoming a little bit heated, I take out my dark chocolate and it's the Pavlov reaction. So they almost know, it's time for us to cool down. And then they're receiving some dark Belgian chocolate. I don't know what was the origin of your chocolate.
Well, I have to tell you, when I'd fly back from the United States or Canada or for elsewhere, I always had to go through Brussels and catch SN Brussels Air down to Freetown. And so I would always buy a pound of Belgian chocolate and bring it down, and everybody expected it, actually. It was like Pavlov's dog. I mean, I showed up from overseas, passing through Brussels. The office expected Belgian chocolate. So is that good enough?
Okay, that's okay.
We have the same tradition. Isn't that amazing? Belgian chocolate.
Yeah, some countries are well known to provide war criminals. We are only known for beer and chocolate.
Beer's good.
That ain't bad.
That's good. That's not bad. That's not bad.
And I must say, I've eaten dark chocolate, and people who have worked with me will say that Serge's suggested proposition doesn't work with me.
Okay, you are different. Yeah, you are a difficult case. Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to add, Nick,
about the chocolate?
Just chocolate and beer. But just, because this is another fantastic question here. Just emotionally, professionally, going into your trial situation, and tell us more.
I would also just say that these cases are extremely complex. And the amount of evidence, it's very different from a domestic case. Where if you handle a domestic case, we used to have the file was called a murder book we'd get from the homicide detectives. And often was this thin, sometimes in a big case it was this thick. But that doesn't compare to what we have. What we have in these cases in our database for Cambodia is about 1 million pages. The case file started the trial with about 400,000 pages, and it's expanded. It must now be close to 1 million pages on the case file. You have to organize things. Obviously, no one's going to know everything that's in 1 million pages, so you have to work as a team, and you have to organize. and build a case, not just to show crimes happen, not just to show the accused held this position, but then to link how did that position and his responsibilities result in the crimes. And that's always the big challenge. So there's a lot of very unglamorous documents, selecting documents, reviewing documents, selecting witnesses. As a prosecutor, you have a very difficult responsibility. If there's anything in your files that would be exonerating, that would help the defense, even though you think it doesn't really matter, but if you were the defense attorney, you would want it. It's your obligation to turn it over, and you actually risk your case. You could lose your conviction if you fail to do that. And I think everyone here knows that that's a huge burden on the prosecution. It's one of the most difficult parts of the job.
Sir.
The last thing I wanted to add in relation to this question about emotions. I think for all of us, our tribunals are located in different countries. So we're not today confronted with the suffering of individuals. We are unfortunately mainly dealing with the organizational and administrative issues. Where are we getting the money? Where we have to hire staff, and then we have all those UN rules which somehow make our life very, very difficult. And then once a month, as far as I'm concerned, we have victims organizations coming to The Hague. I'm going to the region like the Mothers of Srebrenica. Those are the wives, the daughters, the mothers of those 8,000 boys and men killed in Srebrenica. And those are very difficult meetings sometimes because those people are angry. They are crying, they're very emotional about it. But for me, and I'm sure for my colleagues it's the same experience, it really reminds us why those tribunals have been created, and it gives us really the positive energy to go through all those administrative hurdles we have to deal with every day, because we know it is for a great purpose and it is expected from us.
Fantastic. Thank you. Back to college question.
My question is for the deputy prosecutor. My name's Catherine, I'm Freedom, but I was earlier today, the issue of this view that the ICC is somehow targeting Africa and bullying Africa in a way was addressed, but I just wanted to add to that discussion a little bit and ask about the view that the ICC and the other courts as well recognize that as being to whether it's Western centric or colonial. I wonder in relation to say now Nigeria with Boko Haram and organizations like Deliberations and Niger Delta, there can be an argument that those organizations wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the past decade or even longer of oil spills. I think there have been several hundred within the past decade. Most of the corporations in the oil Dutch shell. So it's an irony that a Dutch company is causing these atrocities that then produce more atrocities when it's based near the Hague. So how can we work in order to actually address some of the root causes of conflict, like going after corporations in a way? Is that a possibility, or is it just like trying to catch them?
Well, I think with any case you bring, you have to have solid evidence, solid linkage. You've got to be able to show cause and effect. We are a court in the end. Different organizations may do different things to raise consciousness about problems, and there may be a lot of validity in what you say about the root causes of some of the difficulties in a country like Nigeria. But our approach really is to with the statute, the Rome Statute as our frame of reference to deal with whatever situation is brought to us as a function of that. I mean, we do have what is called a preliminary examination ongoing in relation to Nigeria. A preliminary examination is a process for determination of whether or not there is a reasonable basis to proceed with an investigation. And I'm not telling tales out of school because it's been in our published reports that given all the different situations that have occurred in Nigeria, the primary focus of concern in terms of Rome Statute crimes is Boko Haram. no question about that. But to deal more generally with the situation, the motivation for the International Criminal Court to exist at all is the suffering of millions of people. The focus really is upon the plight of victims. So when we're involved in African situations, we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of African victims. We are serving African people. And it so happens that in the early years of the court's existence, the main entities that have come to seek the court's assistance have been African states. And the court itself wouldn't exist except for African states. It's the largest regional bloc in the Assembly of States Parties. There are 34 African states in the Assembly of States Parties. The first ratifying state, if I'm not mistaken, was Senegal. And the most recent one is the Côte d'Ivoire. So we are very much embedded in Africa. I have noted, even in filings on behalf of a government which is not exactly friendly to us, the government of Kenya, that there is a recognition that the International Criminal Court is a Kenyan court. And in fact, a High Court judge in Kenya, in Nairobi, has ruled in one of his decisions that the International Criminal Court is a Kenyan court. It's part of the Kenyan judicial system. Somehow we have to overcome the notion that we're a foreign entity, when in fact we're not. We're part of the judicial system of any country, any state that accepts us and accepts the jurisdiction that we have. To me, it's inevitable as the court got into operation, began to do its business, its work, that there was going to be pushback. And there are all sorts of interests that are harmed by that sort of approach. And so, of course, there is pushback. It's inevitable. And there is immense support for the court on the African continent, particularly among civil society members, but also just ordinary people. In fact, if there's any anger and bitterness about the court, I think it's about some of the failings of the court, some of the difficulties that the court has had in delivering justice in the way that we would want to. So, as Fatou Bensouda was saying privately, the kind of support, expressions of support, and in fact the actual support we get from African states is remarkable. We wouldn't be able to do the work that we do in all of the situations we have that happen to be African situations without that. So I think there's a lot of noise out there, but in fact, the relationship that we have with African states and others in the African continent is much stronger than people realize. The other thing I have to say is that it is inevitable, given the state of the world, that the International Criminal Court will become involved in a situation out of Africa. And I've said to the Rwandan ambassador, Rwanda being one of our great supporters and cheerleaders, speaking ironically, that 20 years from now, people will look back and say, what was all the fuss about? Right now, it so happens at this stage of the court's history and development, the situations that have attracted attention and needed urgent intervention have been in Africa. There's a lot of conflicts there, a lot of difficulties, but in the state of the world today will inevitably be out of Africa. I'm not going to predict when and where that will be, but I can see it coming.
I think I want to add also that many of the conflicts which will result in these international crimes, really the root cause behind them are generations of injustice, legal and social injustice, prolonged violation of human rights, disrespect for the rule of law, unequal distribution of resources in many countries, poverty, etc. So whilst we need to focus very much on combating impunity through a process of accountability, it's also important that we focus on preventive strategies which would aim at preventing the occurrence of the conflict which leads to these crimes. And that means, therefore, trying to encourage the development in many countries for an environment where human rights are respected, where you have independent judiciaries, you have respect for the rule of law, you have a kind of more equitable distribution and allocation of national resources, etc. I think all that helps to reduce conflict and to prevent conflict, because conflict is usually the setting for these international crimes. That's a major focus we should have, trying to prevent these conflicts in order to make sure that these international crimes are not committed.
I think while we could go on for a while, I'd like to end with a question from a teacher, Jim Gang. And Jim, you train countless teachers throughout the year, and you work on issues of international justice. And I love the question that you had. You give so much to us as students and as teachers. Jim, I thought your question was a nice way to give something back to our panel. So if you could give that for everybody, I appreciate it.
Sure. I do work with Drew on a lot of humanitarian type things, but most importantly, we work together at the Summer Institute with these wonderful students. And this year we had students at 7th grade all the way through 12th grade. Some of them knew that they wanted to be international prosecutors when they get older, and some of them didn't know what they were having for supper that night. So there's a variety there. But all of their heads and hearts are in the right places. And they all want to be involved in humanitarian issues somehow. And they all look at you, and Drew says all the time, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and they look at you as giants. I would dare say there's a Dave Crane fan club based somewhere out of West Seneca.
Really?
My feet are firmly planted in the Surge fan club, though.
Because of beer and chocolate?
Because when I asked him, I asked him when he was doing, he's 16, he said he's trying to figure out how fast he could go on a motorcycle. I said, I like that guy a lot. My question really is, what do you need from them?
From them.
Yeah. May I start that? I think that there are two things that would be very important to fighting impunity and also spreading fairness, equality under the law and justice. The first is, let's do away with these two most divisive words in any language, and that is us and them. Because people use this concept to manipulate some of us to do horrible things to others of us. And most of us stand by and let it happen because we think, well, that's them. And what I suggest to you, having been around the world, seen victims in every setting, is that there aren't any them. It's all us. And once we break down this idea of this artificial barrier, I think it's much harder to do something to somebody who is a part of us. So that's the first thing I think we can do, is get rid of these two terrible words. The second thing is, you don't have to be involved in the international criminal arena or even any criminal arena to bring more fairness and justice and to end impunity. Because what I suggest to you is that what you allow or do not allow in your everyday lives reflects what will be allowed or not allowed on the international stage. So if we demand in our everyday lives that all of us be treated with respect and fairness and justice, then I think it's going to be much harder at the international level to treat people unfairly and unjustly and without respect.
Here, here.
If I would have a request or a wish for you, would for sure be that you stay believers in the system of justice, international justice, accountability. But I think there's a tendency nowadays with all those conflicts where people are saying, justice is not working, we have to look for other options. And I think one of the lessons learned for all of us is that if there's no accountability, if those who are really responsible for the worst crimes are not punished, there cannot be any reconciliation in a society, and we cannot move forward. So even if there are nowadays a lot of challenges, a lot of problems in international justice or justice in general, stay believers in accountability and pushing your respective societies and surroundings for support for any mechanism, international or national, because it's also not us versus them. If we speak about international justice versus national justice, what is important is accountability wherever it is delivered.
I have a very practical request. You're very fortunate to live in the United States, the only superpower that remains. The United States is a global leader in every field, but it's not playing that role in respect of the Rome Statute. And I think what you ought to do, your generation should work towards ensuring that this country takes on a leadership role in respect of the ICC. How? By becoming party to the Rome Statute.
This was your answer.
I would just say, as most of you, or all of you, I believe, are Americans, I'm also an American. As Hassan said, the United States plays a particularly important role in the world because of the economic and military and political power that it has. Just the importance of understanding what's going on in the world. It's a very big country, and many Americans don't even travel outside of it. But whether you travel or not, these conflicts that are occurring around the world are complex. It's not just a matter of understanding that there's tremendous suffering or hearing the story of the victims of these conflicts in places like Syria or in Rwanda, but also understanding the complexity of the situation and the causes of those conflicts, so that you appreciate and encourage your government to act responsibly and in a sophisticated manner. There's not easy answers to any of these questions.
Well, you gave us some fantastic and inspirational answers today. And for 3 years in a row, thank you for making it happen. And on behalf of all of us, we really appreciate your time and your heart and your gentle spirit here with us today. So thank you.
Thank you. American Youth for the Rome Statute. American Youth for the Rome Statute campaign.
So, students involved, I'll take you through the steps.
You will decide.